I mean, that's why I really love being a physician, because it's the best way, outside of being ecumenical, maybe a priest and all the rest of these other things like that, a religious person, of serving and having the humility of actually knowing that you got crazy swag with your knowledge base, but the humility that if I can't humble myself to be able to connect with that person in real time as a real person, it's lost.
Dr. Winn, we are so happy to have you here. Welcome to the Sheltuh Podcast.
Well, thank you very much, and I feel blessed to be on your set.
Before we get into nitty gritty of things, communicate to people who are you, who you about, where you come from.
Yeah, so bottom line is I think that every time people look at and they see a cancer center director or they see an associate vice chancellor, what they see is somebody who just had maybe potentially even a silver spoon the whole way, all of their life. That was not my grind. So keeping it real, I am the product of a 15-year-old mom, from New York. But I'm also a product of a whole entire family and a whole entire hood that whether I was at Notre Dame or whether I was at Michigan or whether I was doing whatever, it was also a way of keeping me not only grounded, but actually part of my education was beyond the medical school and beyond the fellowships and beyond the residency, recognizing that there was this constant theme, right, of how I was going to come back, touch my community, and figure out how to help. Wow. That didn't come from the books. And interestingly enough, that didn't even come, from many of my advisors who wanted me to actually get the actual practice of medicine together. But the concept of how do I touch and how do I reach back to not only my community, but keep it local and then have national impact came straight up from my family. So that's what I'm about the whole concept of bridging what I grew up, knowing that, getting my care in cases from federally qualified health centers as I was growing up, and making sure, having academic people come into our neighborhoods, right? We used to call it the parachute. They come in, do their studies, they probably got to be assistant professors, they probably get the associate professors on the backs of the people in the community, we never saw them. So the goal for me always coming up, again, in my young mind was, how I was gonna do something, how I was gonna be something. So that's my mom, and that's my mom, my grandmom, and my dad and my family. That's how that rolls.
It definitely highlights the importance of privilege, right? And no matter what you go through, the perception of privilege can vary, right? With regards to your passion, what you've been through, you develop a skill set, you develop a passion, and that's privilege. And I think that we all come from very complex situations, right? Me, Southside Chicago, Leslie, been through a lot of different things, and I'm sure with your breadth of knowledge, you develop a certain skill set for that. And so no matter how hard a situation is, after you now looking at retrospect, that was a huge privilege and blessing for going through that, because now that's propelled you to great things.
In fact, that was that identity. People talk about resilience, but part of the resilience is understanding that you don't need to give up your culture to be.
Yes.
Right. In fact, that sometimes is the struggle that we don't talk about, particularly as medical students and residents going through. You learn skill sets. You're learning how to become a doctor. But while you're learning to become a doctor, you're adopting, these skills and this culture, and you're being invited into this culture. But you also have another culture, right, that you have advantage to of sometimes talking to a patient and being able to say, hey, man, here's what they're trying to say.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? Let me break this down to you, because really what it is about acquiring skill sets. And the best doctors, I've always thought, had the best way of communicating, because you have to communicate. You could be the smartest doctor in the world and still kill your patients, because one, your patients don't trust you. So you be giving out perfect information, but if your patients don't trust you because they can't feel you, right, they won't take that medicine. That medicine winds up in the garbage, and they wind up still with the same blood pressure. You scratching your head figuring out what's the next differential. The differential, right, is that you couldn't connect, right? So one of the other things that I think that was really important for me to learn back where my hood gave me strength, right? Where I came from gave me strength is a situation of being resilient, but also that if I couldn't talk to my family, my grandmother would say, well, you must be smart, but I don't understand what you said. And immediately that would actually have me say, well, if she don't understand, if she doesn't understand, then what, again, chance do my patients? Because I love my grandmother and my mother. So if they don't understand how I'm coming at them, how then do my patients who are working in jobs at Walgreens or whatever and just coming up off their shift, they come to see me and they're coming to hear me sort of say to them, this is what you need to do. But before you do that, they have to understand what it is you're saying. And so that became the important lesson for me throughout my whole life, and that was not in the classroom.
So let me ask you this. I mean, you explained that so beautiful. So how did your circumstances growing up? So you mentioned that your mom was 15 when she had you.
15.
Brother, how did that?
Proud of that, though.
Absolutely.
Right. Proud of that.
That's a privilege.
Proud of that.
Yeah.
How did growing up influence your passion and direction and shape you to be like the person you are right now?
Yeah, well, back in the day, though, when I was growing up, man, I mean, I really, my aspirations was to be the youngest foreman at GM. That's what I wanted to do. Luckily, that didn't work out for me. But the reality was to do better, clearly, than, what was actually happening in my surroundings. It was, I mean, again, this is with mentorship, where people see things in you before you see them in yourself. When I was at Notre Dame, I mean, I have to give props. When I was at Notre Dame, it was Father Walter and Father Austin, who were head of the pre-professional programs, who said to me, you ought to be a physician. And, and I had to be honest with you. At first, I was like, come on, man. I was like, they were priests, but I was like, come on, man. I don't think I could do that. And they were like, well, I remember going back and forth with them sort of and telling me why. Well, why do you think you can't? And in retrospect, I look at that and kind of say, why was I in that position, right? I was in that position because we're always told, that you have to be so smart. So again, coming back to perception. Well, no, doctors look like this. Doctors talk like this. Doctors dress like this. I ain't the one. I mean, you can see me on a Saturday right now. You know what I'm saying?
In your natural element.
Natural element, man. I mean, you know what I'm saying? But when you actually look at what you're supposed to be, and as you go through being medical students resident, there comes this thing of how you're supposed to be, as opposed to just saying, no, I am. I'm good enough because I am, right? And I'm going to accept the skill sets because that's my tools of what I have to use to make people healthy. Gotcha. So, so what I'm saying is that became an evolution of how I got there, because it wasn't just me. I mean, I started off with my community, but all along the way, there have been people who saw things in me, occasionally when I ain't seen it myself, that helped me get to where I am. So I always sort of say a reflection of those people more than I am anything else, right? And so I've never left the fact that my hood matters. And when I represent and do things good for patients and get in some press things here and there, that's my community, because somebody's going to say, oh yeah, hi, that's him, right? And so I've never left my home in the context of this journey forward. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, and me and Lex talk about this all the time, because when we are on these floors with patients, right, who don't look like us, it's very important. There's a give and take to it, because when I talk to this one patient who may not, her only recollection of seeing someone like me is on a TV not with a white coat on, right, with a hoodie, something like that, right? So it's very important that no matter how long I take her to get that history, that she understands that when she sees someone else like me, don't put me in a box. Because if you don't put me in a box, you can't put my other brother in the box, that young lady in the box. And so what you bring up is very important, because we have to be, sometimes it could sort of be a disadvantage when you're holding your whole society on your shoulders. But the privilege of that is that, you know what? If we have to be the sacrificial lambs to make that transition as far as our people, then so be it, right?
Right. And in fact, it becomes an honor, right? Because what does Maya Angelou sort of says, when I come in, I walk in, I'm 10,000 strong.
Yes.
You feel me?
Yes.
So the reality is, when I actually, in Colorado, for example, right, #1 pulmonary program, arguably in the country at the time, right? I mean, at Ghana, Michigan, #3. Colorado's #1, right? All when they talk about the Michael Jordans of pulmonary and critical care, there were like 30 of them running around. A guy who invented ABGs, the person, Dr. Petty, who introduced the whole concept of ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome, which is, we first found out in Vietnam, right? When people would come back with fluid in their lung. And how did that happen, right? He was part of that, right? He was part of that whole team of bringing the ventilator into, right? I'm talking about the cavalcade of stars.
Right.
So when you're up there, you would sort of say, oh, okay, wait a minute, y'all the best of the best. But it clicked into me that I'm 10,000 strong, so I'm here to represent.
Yeah.
So, the very first patient I had was from what we call sort of central Colorado. And he came up and he looked at me and he straight up sort of said, Doc, I have a problem. And I was like, what? And he literally said, I have a problem because, you're, I said, black? He goes, well, yeah. So long story short, that guy had gone to 3-4 other doctors who missed the diagnosis. Feel me? Mm-hmm. Again, this is where training comes in. I'm getting all this training from the best possible place in the country. That's why he came there, got referred there. We figured it out. I figured it out. You know what he wanted to do there? Bring his whole family, right? And so I didn't have to change who I was to interact. I just had to, in that case, make sure that I actually bought that fire, bought the skill set, bought the talent that I was trained to do, right, without losing me in that whole thing. I mean, the interaction was, you see Dr. Winn, you see Dr. Winn, right? You can be Asian, you're gonna see Dr. Winn. African American, you're gonna see Dr. Winn, right? You can be Caucasian, from a WASP family, you're gonna see Dr. Winn, right? Because the reality is, I'm like, you're coming to me, literally, right? For me to, as a servant, to serve you by making sure I can communicate with you effectively and making sure that I can come up with the right diagnosis for you. So, I mean, he's a rancher, so he literally said, you know what, I'm gonna bring my whole family down here to see you. And I was like, oh, okay. But in fact, what we did by not actually sort of kowtowing and not feeling that it was a burden, what happened in that context is something that really what you dream about in TV, right? This rancher who had never really been taken care of by an African American, then actually had the trust, not only for his doctor, but the doctor didn't have to say, well, I'm not African American, I'm who I am, right? But it transcended all of that, you know what I'm saying? To this man now sort of saying, wow, I'm coming to see you and I want my family to see you, right? That's the whole thing I'm talking about being able to move on this journey without also losing yourself, but becoming, and gaining other skill sets and gaining other knowledge. I mean, that's why I really love being a physician, because it's the best way, outside of being ecumenical, maybe a priest and all the rest of these other things like that, a religious person, of serving and having the humility of actually knowing that you've got crazy swag with your knowledge base, but the humility that if I can't humble myself to be able to connect with that person in real time as a real person, it's lost.
With regards to all that's in medicine, what brought you to pulmonary care?
So funny, I mean, again, people saw something in me before I saw something in anybody else. When I was a resident, a chief resident, this is around my chief resident time, there was one of the godfathers of what we call pulmonary critical care medicine. And back in the day, it's when he came to do a lecture, there were carousels that used to put actual slides. Y'all don't know nothing about this.
No, we don't.
Y'all don't know nothing about this. Now listen, you used to put these slides in there, you would get stuck. You'd have to figure out on the fly, like, how am I gonna get this talk done, right? So anyway, his carousel was there, and he's about to do his talk, and it all fell over, right? And in fact, he started to, get a little freaked out, and he said, I go, Doc, hey, Dr. Petty, who subsequently passed, giant in medicine, pulmonary medicine. So I said, no, I got this. I go, we got a couple seconds. I'm going to delay the talk by 10 minutes. This is going to be good. We can just go through. I'm going to take you to a quiet room. And from that day forward, he actually talked to my chair and said, he's coming to Colorado. He's the kind of critical care guy we need. He goes under pressure. He used to always sort of say he's probably the coolest cucumber under pressure. But I was like, I control the clock, man. I'm good.
I like that.
I'm like, ain't nothing to that. I control the clock. Yeah. So, but to Dr. Petty, he always thought, wow, really stressful situation, critical situation. You kept your cool. You kept that you should become a pulmonary critical care doctor. So it was after the conversation with Marvin Schwartz, Tom Petty in my chair, that I said, yeah, all right, let's do this, pulmonary critical care. And I've always admired, even when I was at Rush, the pulmonary critical care doctors were there, Dr. Balk, and there were a bunch of guys over there who I just admired, who were just great. So I said, yeah, all right, I'll give a shot at this. So that's literally how I fell into it.
So how did you transition to cancer research?
Yeah, so this is, again, part of the secret of being at the right place at the right time sometimes. And I got, to think about this. When we think of cancer, what do you think about? You usually think now of oncologists. All right, but here's what I will put to you. Before, there was chemotherapy, which didn't really come about until like the 60s. The only way you were able to treat cancer in the beginning was if you saw it, you had to cut it out. If you couldn't cut it out, there wouldn't be right? So that developed, right, sometimes with, cisplatin and all these other, drugs we kind of came up with in the 60s, right, and all the rest of this other stuff, 50s and 60s, right, of now having compounds and therapies. Well, the crazy part about that is before you even get the diagnosis of lung cancer, how do you even get the tissue? Right? Because it's not like we Star Trek yet where I can put my hands on you and be like, oh, you have cancer, right? That spot on your lung, on your chest x-ray, so you're looking at your chest x-ray, that spot is cancer, right? So you had to diagnose it. And so I just was blessed to be at the right place where there were almost 275 pulmonary doctors, world class, right? We're defining these things. And of those, there were a handful who were just focused on cancer. James Jett was a pulmonologist who gave chemotherapy. These guys were looking at, lasers and, stents before anybody else were actually even thinking about it. And so I was just blessed to be at an outstanding institution, the University of Colorado National Jewish, for my training, and then recognize that we couldn't do anything with cancer at that time anyways. I mean, think about this, 1999, if you come in with lung cancer, we're like, most of the time, if you couldn't cut it out, we would say, well, if it were advanced, we tell you, have you ever been to Disney World or Alaska? You want to go fishing? Have you ever been to that? Right, because that was the state of, it was really bleak.
Right.
So while we were there, I started figuring out that the only way we were going to do it is by figuring out the science, right? And that's when the genetics were coming on board. So the whole genome was unlocked. So there was a fascination for me about what if we were able to understand the genome, unlock the secrets of the genome, would I be able to then reprogram or re-Jimmy, if you will, the system so that we could actually treat the cancers. So that was actually going on right there. So not only were the pulmonologists like York Miller and others, who were ahead of their time, and James Jett, who were ahead of their time as pulmonologists, but there were also people like I want to say his name is Paul Bunn, who was one of the first about genetics and cancers, who were actually on that campus at the same time, who not only did they see something, I started knocking on their doors and saying, hey, I got an idea, what about this? And they, from that enthusiasm and that energy, they surrounded me with the skill set of actually learning how to be a basic scientist. And then the rest is, just, kind of putting it together. But again, sometimes being at the right space at the right time, with a couple right people, and then getting a good idea and then knocking on their doors, that was really an evidence of what I would call my fellowship training. Actually really, I think, steeled my interest in cancer, but steadied my goal and approaches of how I would get there with research.
And with regards to research, it's really important. And our community, specifically Black community, when it comes to medical research, there's a very taunting and very horrific history when it comes to that. We're talking about Henrietta Lacks and the HeLa cells, and talking about the Tuskegee syphilis trials. With regards to what your position of research, and with regards to how without research we can't invest as a medical community, how can the community benefit from research with such a, yes, rich history, but also a very sad history?
Y'all get real deep in it, which I like. So let me unpack this for you about why I think that there's a lot of positivity in research, and particularly for our community. When the Tuskegee study, which people call Tuskegee, had nothing to do with Tuskegee, right? It's the United States public health study of 1932. Started on biology. You know what the biology was? You can go back to the early papers. If you go back to the early papers, what they thought was that African Americans, blacks at that time, were the perfect control group, because they thought blacks were in some ways inferior and could not get syphilis, right? Because they were, inferior, right? So more, like apes didn't get syphilis, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So part of this was involved with this movement forward to actually understand how we can save humanity by actually using syphilis as a study in African Americans because they couldn't contract it. Long story short, you and I know that was not true.
Right.
So that was one of the most damaging. Now you can go to things with the birth control pill. We got a laundry list of things. In fact, one of the worst offensive though is, beyond even Tuskegee, things that we probably didn't even know about completely, okay? But those were things being done to us. In 1979, 1969, 1959, and 49, things were being done probably to us. As a result of that, though, we've gotten, again, a lot of benefits out of that by making sure that the system is straight. This is why you have the Institutional Review Board now, where community participates in. And I always say to all the people in the community, if you really want to get involved and make sure research ain't being done to you, then get involved with those Institutional Review Boards, which you have a right to be part of. They're at all institutions and anybody doing research.
I didn't know that.
But here's the problem. In 2019, you have miracle drugs. I talked to you about when I started, 1999, man, we would tell people to go home. Well, would you take the chemo? I don't know. It may work, it may not. In 2019, we're sophisticated enough to know that there are genes that you have that if they're overexpressed or a certain type, I got medicines for you now. I can almost cure you. We got immunotherapy, which I know people read in the news and don't really completely understand it. We can do another show on that, but we ain't gonna go all that deep in it, but immunotherapy is tight, right? But this whole thing about reprogramming and getting your immune system involved to actually kill tumors in lung, all of a sudden now you've gone from 1999 to 2019 as a result of research, knowing that I got medicines that I can pull off my shelf, right? Whether it's immunotherapy or genetic, what we call molecular targeted therapy, or even better chemotherapy, that not only are life-saving, but could actually help you not only survive, but thrive. We got examples out of breast cancer. We got women now, because of HER2/neu, which is another gene, because we can target that, they're not just surviving, they're thriving 15 years out of advanced stage cancer that they would have been dead for. Where does that come from? That comes from research. So we are at the precipice right now, at this crossroads, that if, as a community, if we're not participating in research, these miracle drugs may be there for some, but not for all of us.
You bring up a valid point, because with regards to these miracle drugs, and it come through clinical trials, a lot of us are not represented with these drugs, and I think it's just, I'm very limited in my knowledge with regards to that, but even in lecture, we have a professor who talks to us about, we did this one study, and I asked the professor, has this study been done with, application to minorities in medicine? And he looked at me, he was like, no. And I was like, oh, well, we should look into that. And the lecture was about the very high prevalence of physicians who unfortunately commit suicide due to the situation that's going on. And the whole study was about white men.
All white men.
All white men. And I was like, so what's the studies about, brothers and my other minorities who are going through the journey of medicine? And he looked at me, he was like, oh, no. Well, okay, cool. All right, cool. All right, we can make the next point. So it just goes to show you, not far as choice and far as community empowerment, that we need to be involved.
We need to be involved right now. With technology, man, the way technology and the research that's now resulting in the miracle drugs that we actually have of our time, if we are not a part of that, we now widen the disparities. So it's not so much what was being done. Back in the day, it was what was being done to us. Right now, it's an issue that's critical around what's not what we're being left out of, right? But to be, part of that, we have to step up too and say, yes, our communities want to be able to participate in these research with one caveat. We want to know what's going on.
Absolutely.
And the reality is, one of the things I've been demanding about from communities is if that you're going to participate in research, one of the other caveats we need to make as a community, and again, I know this ain't, I'm standing on the side of researchers and people all over will probably get mad, but the community actually has a right to know what happened after the research. That's called the dissemination process. It's not enough just to get me in a study and then find out there's a miracle drug, 5 years, 10 years later, that's life-saving. We all feel good about that. If we were able to participate in a study that would affect the younger generation, that would cure, for example, sickle cell or these other things, all of us would sort of say, yeah, let's jump up on that, right? But what you'd want to know is what happened to the study? What I participated in, did it, obviously it mattered, even if it was negative or positive, it all mattered, but what happened? There's a decency of sort of saying, if I give you $10 for a loan, to make an investment, what happened to my investment? That'd be a natural, right? What's the ROI? And yet we talk about in medicine as there is no ROI. It's just thank you for your contribution to humanity. We got to get up off of that and actually demand. Communities have to make more demands of us to say, what's the information you giving back, right? The ROI. But again, I think that one of the dangers I actually have as an African-American male that I worry about is that we will participate less and less. Therefore, there'll be less and less relevance to these drugs to us. And when we get miracle drugs that might happen in a 70-year-old white man, and then we ask them, why doesn't this work the same way in African-Americans? We have to sort of say to ourselves, what's our responsibility? What's our part in that? You know what I mean?
So, good transition point is I want to ask you about the bench to community model of research. What does that mean and entail, and how does the bench to model community and develop methods to ensure equal access to cutting edge technology?
And I like what you just said, equal access, because that's why we put the community part up in there. The bench to bedside model is something that you guys have grown up with your whole entire life. That means, as we were just talking about these new miracle drugs, that someone is, the mad scientist is at their research laboratory, which some people have seen on those shows in their white coat, and they're coming up with saying, I got it now, eureka, this gene is gonna, right? And then they figure all the things that can happen. And then what happens is you sort of say, how is this applied to humans, right? So once you figure that out, you say, well, then it's applied to humans in the following way, right? Those are the clinical trials we talk about, that's the bedside. But here's the problem with our community. The reason why the bench to bedside model was short for me is because most of us ain't getting to the bedside. So as you develop all this research, if you're not participating and you're not in these trials and you're not in the bedside and you're not at these hospitals, then you're not getting the benefit of any of that research. So I said, let's take it to the street, right? Because here's some of the other things we can learn in the street. One of the things I've actually learned was if you go to the community, you could convince the community more to participate if they actually knew that, for example, in the 20th ward or one of the wards of Chicago, that 3 times more African-American men were dying from prostate cancer than they were in the United States. And then they were, in the rest of the state of Illinois. What's that based off of? Data. So one of the other things you talked about, the precision medicine thing that I've done, which was the All of Us program that was initiated by President Obama, and yes, we do miss him. Just to put that plug up in there.
No,
but just put that plug up in
y'all
there.
heard that, right?
Just put that plug up in there. We miss him. But the reality is that whole thing was a president understanding that technology and data was going to have tremendous impact on our communities, right? And so the reality is not to actually be deliberate about making certain that all these miracle drugs, all this new technology, all these things were meant for, going back all the way to what my mama taught me, to the community, then what was I doing this for? So one of the things I came here specifically for was to really start putting forth the first model in the country of sort of saying we are audacious and bold enough to say that everything we do, we're actually thinking about how this can actually get out to our communities. And so that's where the term comes from, because the bench to bedside, we've been working under for like the last 50, 60 years, right? And it really means you come to the bedside, we experiment, we take the drugs to you in the bedside, then we get that in clinical markets, and then, hey, if you're lucky enough, then, but what would happen if you flip that and started talking about my interest as a scientist in RNA binding protein and how that impacts you? What if we start sort of saying, let's get data from the community. Let's figure out, for example, that your ZNA, that is your zip code or neighborhood of association, probably has a much more predictive value of your outcome than your DNA, right? The deoxynucleic, that we actually talk about with, Watson and Crick sort of. What if we figured out that really from a neighborhood, we can even think about some structural issues that can contribute to chronic disease, and now we can untangle that. This is one of the reasons why the bench to community model, and we can even flip that and say the community to bench if we really wanted to get going with it, but you know what I'm saying? That it should start with community and build out to what research is actually needed from that, right? Because actually that makes it more about the chasing of academic excellence, which we all do. All of us are about, and every physician ought to be about the chasing of academic excellence. But the reality is I've come to a point in my life where I recognize I want to take that academic excellence and transition it into something that I'm calling academic relevance. That means the study and the knowledge and the new knowledge that I get and I gain, that it becomes relevant and impactful to our communities, because otherwise you get this disconnect of discovery science, but it's not implemented in the community. And that Harold Freeman actually got back in the late 1990s is a critical disconnect, right? Of the research that's not connected to the community. And in fact, I didn't want to play that anymore. So I straight up just said, why not? This is like, back up in the 80s and stuff, man. You just claim things. Be like, we just gonna have a tag, it's gonna call bench community. So that's how that came about.
Yeah, absolutely. Go to cancer in the community. Yeah.
All right. With regards to, your position within the Cancer Center at UIC, from your vantage point, what are the top 3 cancers that our people unfortunately suffer from at this current time?
Yeah, and I wish I could say the top 3, but I'm gonna tell you one thing. African Americans tend to be number 1 in almost all cancers. So top, lung, obviously breast, prostate, GI, colon, these types of deals. But when it comes to cervical cancer, right, when it comes to ovarian cancer, and so unfortunately, as a people, the reality is, the sad reality is that we are number 1 in some things we would like to be not number 1 in, but number 1 in most cancers, or particularly in the incidence of getting it, but more importantly, we lead the country in the number of deaths as it's associated with cancer. So we carry a heavy burden, which is one of the other reasons why I thought my foray back, even as a fellow at University of Colorado National Jewish, when I had the opportunity to do something, asthma is important, no doubt. Nobody should ever die from asthma. Interstitial lung disease, that means the scarring that's up in your lung is important. But the reality is there were really very few African American voices in the cancer field. And so again, part of my motivation was to actually have an impact on that. And lo and behold, I would never have guessed that I would be a cancer center director because there are very few. In fact, I think there's non-HBCU cancer center directors. I think I'm the only one African American. But you know what? The reality is 2019 is just the beginning. Hopefully by 2029 or 2039, that's going to change.
I believe it's going to change. And with regards to how we as a community are very high prevalent with all these type of cancers, what can we do to alleviate this discrepancy that we see?
Yeah. So that's a very important question. And that is, how are you going to alleviate and how can we mitigate and reduce the burden of cancer on our communities, right? Because we're saying that that's the number 1 killer, whether it's lung, breast, colon, prostate, right? It's the number 1 killer for us in cardiovascular disease and cancer, right? So how do we mitigate it? One, I'm going to go back to something that Dr. Mason always sort of says, and that is what you eat does matter. So looking at issues around sleep, which does matter, diet does matter, exercise does matter. And those are things probably your mom and your grandma told you about, but those things actually turns out they do matter.
Yes.
The other parts that matter are getting screened. Now listen, as African American men, I understand that usually the only way we usually get the doctors, man, listen, the only way we usually get is that we got a mom, a sister, a girlfriend, or somebody else, a significant other who's like, it's time to get checked. You're like, oh, okay. But we have to do a much better job about that. Think about this, that when you're thinking about the preventable cancers, lung cancers, prostate, we're saying that if you can get screened and you can catch it soon enough, you can get cured. And so one of the ways we're going to have to be able to reduce the burden of cancer is really up on us. Not only as men, but women, African-American women, about getting your checkups, but actually understanding that getting age-appropriate screening means age-appropriate screening. Now look, I ain't saying none of this is fun. People say, well, you a doc, you get to do it to people. But I had it done to me too. It ain't fun, but it's necessary if we really want to stay alive. So I think beyond the again, eating right, sleeping, exercise, which turns out is really important. And we'll come back to that whole thing about the food you eat and what it does to your gut and how it can actually predispose you to actually different diseases. We can get on that. We can get on that for real, because that's real, right? Some of that is not because we want to, but some of that's the situation you're in. So we can get to that too. But between the food and exercise, you have the screening, you also have the last part about this, which is, again, the awareness of, if you can participate in clinical trials, but when you get sick, not waiting too late, right? Because I've had people who would say things to me like, I know I had cancer, or I know there was something wrong with me, is what they would say, but I was afraid to come in. You have to get over that fear, particularly, as I told you, with all the miracle therapies we have now, all the new technologies. I have people in my clinic alone that I've actually seen that when I first started my clinic, most of the people showed up with, cancer that couldn't do anything with. I'm now looking at people, man, that we got life-saving events, not only with chemotherapy and the molecular therapies, but also with the surgeries. So from my perspective, recognizing that you have some and having the courage to come in is important.
So how can we change the way folks look at chemotherapy in terms of what it does to you holistically? Because a lot of the time somebody gets sick and get cancer, people are looking at the residual effects of what that process looks like, right?
Yeah.
So how can we better educate people, our community, in terms of that being a viable option for them?
Yeah, and that's a very good question. And I think one of the things I always look to is folks with resources who got mad resources, many of the folks who are some of the richest people in the world, they're not usually running from chemotherapy. They're running towards it, right? Because they understand that if I know your molecular target and I have that medicine, it can not only extend my life, but it can actually give me a quality of life that I wouldn't have otherwise. And so what we have as a community is we're still working in old 20th century language and old 20th century ideas about what the doctors were, what chemotherapy was, what that means when you have cancer. The crazy part is we've now entered into the 21st century, and I think it's this transition that people just haven't caught up yet, that in the 21st century, right, there are things that we can do now. Catch it early. I mean, even if we don't catch it early, there's things that when it's advanced, we can still do things with. So, in fact, there's a number that I actually go back to. In 2027, there's going to be more people living with cancer for the first time than dying from it. So that's near. Now, look at this. So when you're living with cancer, what does that mean? That means we have a new workforce that we're developing. This is going to sound like a little bit like Hidden Figures, but that's okay, right? So I'm starting to push this whole concept of how do we get what we call oncogeneralists. Some people call them survivorship doctors, right? But I'm gonna call them oncogeneralists, right? Generalists who actually understand, we didn't give you your chemo, but if you had an aromatase inhibitor, I know what to look for, right? Or if you had a certain drug, I know to look for your heart. I know to actually do ear test on you or vision test on you because you've gotten this, right? How do we give you the whole concept of wellness around you so that you can live well after your cancer care, right? That was not a 20th century sort of phenomena, right? Because in 1959, if we were 1959, 1969, you'd be like, ooh, yeah, I hope your transition to heaven's going, right? You know, that's how we were thinking. Yeah. But our community, we're delayed in understanding that that's old 20th century thinking. The 21st century brings much promise, and actually more than promise, it's reality. I always sort of say the future is actually here. It's just been unevenly distributed. And the unevenness of the distribution means it's impacted our communities where we don't actually understand it because we don't know, we don't see it, we don't touch it. So we don't know that there's a cure right now for someone even with advanced cancer. So, you know, I've had people sort of say to me, well, you know, Doc, you got early cancer, but if you open me up, it's going to be like, the air is going to span, come on. Man, listen, in the kind of surgery they used to do where they open you all up, and you know, man, that's like back in 1959, 1969. We talking 2019. They have video assisted thoracoscopy. We have ways of actually doing things where there's a very small footprint, so very little scarring whenever possible, right? To do these operations. So I've always maintained that it's not so much that we can't do these things. It's that our communities don't know this stuff.
Okay.
It's almost like actually being back in hip hop and actually just being back with, you know, the Fat Boys. I don't know nothing about them, and you know, things like that. You know, like the Treacherous Three, and not understanding that you had DMX and all the rest of the stuff beyond, right? Because you're still stuck on an island, right? Like there's a new sound, like there's Future and all the rest of that. But you're like, what's that, right? Well, you're right, because you didn't see it. This is a little bit likened to what it is about medicine in our communities. We're like decades behind of what we really should be.
I got a follow-up question as we wrap up towards the big picture ideas. I may get in trouble by saying this, but if I go to my grandmother's house, 56 in May in Inglewood, right? I make that right turn on Garfield and I see a Wendy's. And this whole aspect of what you eat, what you consume, how soy, which has some components of estrogen, and how a lot of times the estrogen can sort of impact the endometrium or the breast tissue, which can lead to certain types of cancers. And then I realized that a lot of our fast food joints that live in our community, that are in our community, look better than the households that's in them, in the surrounding area, and it bothers me, right? And you know, granted, you know, what I just said may be controversial, but it's the truth.
It ain't controversial at all. We are also one of the first centers and the only cancer center in the country that actually has a grant around structural violence. So I'm gonna break that down for you, right? Concept was first brought about in 1969 by Johann Galtung, who actually said those structures that benefit one group and disadvantage another is in this bin of structural violence, right? So think about the fact that we're talking about real, not just sugars, right? We're talking about corn sugars, right? The fructose and the sucrose that we know by Dr. Cantley and others have actually accelerated tumors. But that's what you have access to. right? So it's about this issue about taking and rebuilding our communities by understanding that, yes, the Wendy's are there and the Aldi's are there, and you probably don't have fresh fruit in that Aldi like you do in the Aldi somewhere else, maybe north. And the reality is that there's a structure that allows that to happen. And so sometimes what I want to get out of is this thing about blaming African Americans and people who are in those communities for not actually getting fresh fruits because it's not there. So you make the best choices you have. But this is where it comes back to us having a consciousness as communities and a consciousness as healthcare leaders to start switching the tables and saying, it's not their fault. It's not just the Whole Foods. Where are we getting fresh vegetables from? Where are we getting places where we actually are doing education? And that there is an environment in which people have access to money and resources to buy the foods that they need, right? So it's a very complicated story. So when I usually see an African American come in, I know that there's health disparities work who says, if only African Americans could find, could exercise. Well, sometimes you can't even go out. I mean, the reality is, the way they were banging up in the way they were banging up in New York back up in the 80s and other places around just out here, or even now, right? Yep. You ain't going out on your stoop, your porch, that's a good way. You ain't going out on your porch, right? Or running around the neighborhood. So the reality is there is a reality that health is a team sport, which is why I want to even bring even more attention that it's not just about the bench, but it's about understanding the community and understanding that there are limitations within the community that actually get in the way of people who want to be healthy. If you gave most people the opportunity to be healthy and have fresh fruits and all these other things, you know what we do? We would do that. I've seen it in my lifetime. I know that this is true, right? But when you come from these neighborhoods where you're boxed in and those are your only choices, you're going to do what you can do.
It's a learned behavior as well.
And so one of the things I want to do with the health disparities work is not turn the table on us, the community. Well, they should do better and they should get screening and they should know this. Well, they don't. That's because the education's not there, the structure's not put there to sort of accelerate that sort of awareness and that consciousness. And I think as healthcare providers, one of the things we need to do in the 21st century is get better at that.
So in wrapping everything up, the question is, if you could change one thing, if you could have an impact in terms of your work or in terms of your legacy, what would that mean? What would that be?
I think the legacy for me that I would like to leave behind is an awareness and a consciousness that community matters and that we have to bring back the connectedness of community with not only their health, their wealth, and their well-being, but the connectedness of the power of the community of what it actually has to teach us of how we can be better. And I think that one of the things I would really leave is that science, it doesn't belong to just white folk or rich people. Science belongs to all of us, and that research and the science and the benefit of that new knowledge should help the communities grow. But my legacy, if there's anything, would say that, he was a faithful servant that just wanted to serve. But the one message I would leave behind is that we can't, in our quest to do big science and big data, make our communities invisible. I want to actually re-engage our communities so they become visible in the center of what we do.
I appreciate that. I really do appreciate that. So we got to wrap. Before I wrap up, I almost want to thank you for being here.
Absolutely.
And I told Leslie.
Thank you before y'all go national. I could say I was here before y'all went national. This is great.
No, I really do appreciate it because you bring a very not only intelligent but genuine voice.
Absolutely.
Because there was one event where you acknowledged me. You acknowledged my question, and I want to appreciate that because, to be honest with you, I feel as though you were the person who understood where I was coming from, understood what I was trying to get at, and you acknowledged it in a very genuine way. As a medical student who's trying to find his way out, I appreciate that. I really do appreciate that.
I feel honored by your just having me on your set, and again, this is the state that we shouldn't think is unusual. We talk about unicorns. This is something we hope will become the regular, where you have us in the community talking about things that matter to our communities.
Before also we leave, how can the community get in contact with your services and what UIC is offering to the community?
Oh man, listen, we got several ways. So there's Miles Square that people will know about, University of Illinois Health Miles Square system. And they can pick up a phone and look at University of Illinois Cancer Center. You can go on the web, go on your phone, you can do whatever. The number is there. You need to reach out and get in contact. You can get in contact. Cool. For real, for real.
Cool. All right, well, that's a wrap. Thank you again, Dr. Winn, for being here. Also, if that was a little bit too fast, please reach out to us at the_Sheltuh D_Sheltuh at our Instagram. We'll definitely, for the information, Dr. Winn, and we'll definitely give you guys the resources available so we can make that happen. Oh, yes. And last but not least, I'm sorry, Miss Pat, you see this little Hillman College? Miss Pat, we love you. Please reach out to her merch. Her merch will be in the comment section, in the info section for this post. And thank you again, Miss Pat Hillman College. If y'all know what this is about, I know you know what this is about.
That's right.
Yeah, we're repping Hillman College today. So thank you, Miss
That's right.
Pat, for all the things that you do, and we really appreciate that love. Thank you. Appreciate it.